Okay, right. The idea behind this is to give a series of kind of talks about key elements of the film Laberinto del Fauno, Pan's Labyrinth, as known in English, which is one of the films which is on the WJEC Spanish A2 exam syllabus. So I'm going to be talking through a whole load of issues about the film that hopefully will help with your revision or your understanding of this film. The first thing I'm going to deal with about Pan's Labyrinth is talking about the historical background, how Guillermo del Toro, the director of the film, sets the scene. The first thing we find out in the headings at the start of the film is that the film is set in 1944. Now, in 1944, Spain was basically recovering from the end of the Spanish Civil War. This war basically took place between 1936 and 1939. It was extremely bloody, hard-fought conflict. In a very kind of quick and loose way, it was a fight between the nationalists, which comprised the kind of the right-hand side, the right wing, political right wing of Spain, led by General Francisco Franco, against the left, who were known as the Republicans, which comprised more of the left wing of Spanish society, groups such as communists, socialists, anarchists, and so on. The result was that the Franco-led nationalists defeated the Republicans in 1939, and Franco basically established a very authoritarian dictatorship, which was to last well into the 1970s. So that's basically the background. The Civil War was finished. But at this point in time, as is clear in the setting scene at the start of the film, there were still certain pockets of resistance that were fighting against the Franco forces, such as we see in the film with Pedro and the other guerrilleros, the other rebeldes in the forest. So that's the first thing we see. The second aspect that we see in terms of setting the scene is as the fairy tale at the start, as we hear the story of the princess escaping from the underground kingdom, we see the town of Belchite. This is a ruined Spanish town, a town devastated by the Civil War. It's a town that Spanish people would know. It's very famous for what happened to it, and so again it sets the scene of the impact that the war has had on Spain. The kind of town is both representative of the state of Spain currently, and also of the fact that the underground kingdom has also fallen into ruin as well. The two things are very linked, both Spain under Franco and the underground realm, the underground kingdom. So it's a first kind of symbolic aspect of the film, possibly. The third kind of aspect that really situates the film for us is when we see the rebels, with Mercedes and Dr. Ferreiro, go and visit the rebels in the forest, go and see their base camp in order for the doctor to take a look at Frances's leg, and before he rather unfortunately has to amputate it. In this scene we see the stutterer reading the newspaper, and basically what's happened there is that the Allied forces are about to invade Normandy, or have just done so. This was really relevant because it was thought in Spain by the Maquis, by the people fighting against Franco, that there was a strong chance that the Allies, the Americans and British, would come south into Spain to kind of wipe out all facets of extreme nationalism, such as they were doing with the Nazis. And it was hoped that they would also come into Spain and liberate Spain from the Franco dictatorship. Now, Franco had kind of been outside the Second World War, but the Nazi Party under Hitler had actually supported Franco during the Civil War with the bombing of Guernica by the Condor Legion and so on. So that kind of helps to set the historical scene for the viewer, for the spectator. There are some other historical and political bits of commentary in the film. For example, the peasants that are killed by Vidal. In the first aspect we see of how brutal he really is. They find some leftist propaganda, some news sheets which seem to be talking about kind of communist or socialist kind of ideology. this gives you really an idea of the persecution suffered by socialists, by communists, by the left wing, by people who were opposed to Franco during the war. With Vidal very much obviously representing the Franco's forces, the fact that he doesn't really even question them thoroughly, just ask a couple of questions. There is the scant evidence of these kind of leaflets is enough to kill these men, and that shows really just how bad the situation is. Plus, obviously, casting Vidal as very much the antagonist and as a kind of a monster in the film, as if we were in any doubt. But that really does kind of stress the point. It also gives you a little bit of an idea, possibly, about maybe Del Toro's political leanings. He is relatively sympathetic to the left cause, although you could argue that he's really only interested in those fighting for freedom, who in this case obviously happen to be the left wing in the Civil War and its aftermath. We also see the rationing, the queue for the rations, with the soldier talking about how the Reds lie, how Franco will be providing food and firewood for every house in Spain. Again, that just gives you an idea of the propaganda, the kind of brainwashing, if you like, the control that the Franco's forces were trying to exert by being those responsible for giving food. It wasn't something you could necessarily buy; you had to ration it. So again, you get an idea of the state of Spain under Franco. Just after this, we've also seen the dinner party, and again the opulence that's there. The main reason possibly for showing this, or one of the reasons for showing this, is showing the fact that the church is very much on Franco's side. We see the priest of the area where the film is taking place being part of it all, and again this was very much the case in Franco's Spain as well. So there's a kind of slight criticism of the church in this scene. Other kind of interesting things to notice about, if you're to talk about the history, the scene setting of Pan's Labyrinth. First of all, it's not the first film that was set in this era by Del Toro. A film he'd already made, El Espinazo del Diablo, The Devil's Backbone, was also set during this period, although actually slightly earlier, during the actual war years itself, as opposed to 5 years afterwards. Again, it comes from a position of where the left wing, to some extent, are possibly the heroes of the story. If you've seen The Devil's Backbone, then you'll know that the orphanage that has been run is for comrades of the left, of the Republicans that have died in the struggle or are fighting. They're all orphan children from that wing. We see them trying to hide the religious, to present religious icons to show that they may be actually nationalists after all. So it's kind of the second part of this kind of ghost stories or fantasy stories set in a civil war by Del Toro. So that's something interesting to know. Something also interesting is the fact that many films, or increasingly many films, are beginning to be set that are dealing with the civil war and stories within it. Whether they are critical of the regime, whether they're just portraying life under the regime, or not. There had been for many years following the death of Franco a kind of what you might call a pacto del olvido, a pact of forgetfulness, in which the kind of crimes that had been committed by both sides during the Civil War were largely not discussed for fear of this causing potential ructions within Spanish society. There was a very carefully managed transition, la transición democrática, that led Spain from dictatorial years to more kind of constitutional monarchy and elections. And it was thought by many people that dealing with the war and bringing up all the bad things that happened may have been detrimental, may have caused more kind of outbreaks of violence and so on. So it's interesting to see that now in the well into the 2000s that this has kind of been set to one side, and there have been various films that now deal with this. For example, there is Soldados de Salamina, which comes from the book by Javier Cercas, so Soldiers of Salamis. There is the film Girasoles Ciegos, again that comes from a book by Alberto Mendes, it's called Blind Sunflowers. Pan Negro, which was very successful at the Goyas, is another war film dealing with this era. And again, there's quite a kind of renaissance of literature based around this period of time, and a lot of people are starting to look at it, to use it to discuss the crimes committed And Spain is, for example, I would say, taking more charge or taking more interest in its past and really looking at what happened and why it all went wrong. So there are other films that you might be interested in watching: Soldados de Salamina, El Espinazo del Diablo, Girasoles Ciegos, and Pan Negro. It's fair to say that in many ways this film is a critique of Franco. Very much, Franco is very much present. He's mentioned. Vidal talks about him in the dinner party, and you can't deny that it's very critical of this. You could also say, however, that Del Toro is not just criticising authoritarianism within Spain, but possibly you could extrapolate this to say it's criticising authoritarianism throughout the world. It just happens to be the setting in this particular case, and he does make the moral question that you shouldn't just obey for the sake of it. It is important to believe and fight for what you believe in, to rebel if that is the right thing to do on a moral level. But obviously, it is very much a case of dealing with Spain in particular. So anyway, I hope that's been useful. I'd strongly recommend that it'd be worthwhile reading about the Civil War, reading about Franco's dictatorship, certainly the early years, just to give you an idea of what Mercedes, of what Carmen, of what Pedro and the others, Dr. Ferrer, what they were up against, why they were prepared to give their lives up in a struggle for freedom. There are lots of good YouTube clips you can find which deal with the Spanish Civil War. There's a particularly good Granada one by British Television that's slightly dated now but does deal with the conflict very well. And obviously you'll find a lot of good websites, a lot of good books that deal with the conflict, so that's certainly worth doing. Right, hey, that's been useful. Bye.